Now I'd like to welcome to the stage, please, two people. Nick Willis from MPI, who'll be talking about the colony loss survey that's been conducted, as well as Pike Brown. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. Kia ora. I'm Nick Willis from MPI, and I'm here to introduce New Zealand's first colony loss and survival survey. New Zealand relies on bees. The honeybee is an abundant and readily managed pollinator for pastoral, arable, and horticultural production. Bees pollinate crops worth at least New Zealand 4.5 billion annually to New Zealand's economy. New Zealand exports of pure honey reached 9,046 tonnes, worth 223 million in the year to 30 June 2015. While facilitating the growth in the apiculture sector alongside industry, MPI is active in the protection of the industry also. The need for a comprehensive survey of bee health and beekeeping practices has been discussed with the industry for several years. So, to build a better picture of the state of our honeybees and the challenges that beekeepers are facing, MPI and the then beekeeping organisations, the National Beekeepers Association and the Bee Industry Group of Federated Farmers, contracted Landcare Research to conduct a national survey of managed honeybee colony loss in the spring of 2015. This was the first time it was run in New Zealand. The survey was modelled on colony loss surveys conducted around the world and adapted to the New Zealand setting. This was in consultation with New Zealand beekeepers. The survey provided a baseline of information about the status of hive health, beekeeping practices, and the challenges that beekeepers face. The survey, The survey was delivered online. Anyone registered with Assure Quality as a beekeeper could participate. The survey was anonymous, and the sampling strategy aimed for inclusiveness while targeting New Zealand's largest beekeeping operations. Assure Quality provided us with a list of 316 beekeeping businesses with more than 400 hives. These beekeepers were invited to participate in the survey via email, follow-up phone calls. We pestered them. Links to the survey webpage were advertised to beekeepers via the then National Beekeepers Association and Fed Farmers Bee Industry Group, as well as through clubs, professional organisations, networks and popular media. The survey attracted considerable attention, featured in TV, radio and press. The survey went live from August to the end of October. The 366 responses included 146 from the targeted list. This represents, an excellent 46.2% response rate from the targeted list and 6.7% of all registered beekeepers. It also covered off 39.6% of all registered hives in New Zealand. The project was supported by an advisory group comprising of MPI, the National Beekeepers Association, Fed Farmers Bee Industry Group at that time, AgCalm, and a number of well-known and respected beekeepers. Later on, Pike will acknowledge the individuals. The survey collected information specifically about beekeeping practices, the loss of production hives, nukes, splits and tops over the winter 2015, the causes of those losses, queen health, varroa treatments, supplements and feeding, loss of sites and overcrowding. The final report was published in March this year and is available on the MPI website. Summary data reported by operation, size class and by region is available on the Landcare website. MPI will be funding the survey again in 2016. Over time, we hope this information will help us build a better understanding of the challenges beekeepers face and results from the survey will help MPI to better support the industry to further improve our regulations and policies in the honey industry. If you're interested in finding out more, including participating in the survey, please come and visit us at the MPI stand. I will now hand over to Dr. Pike Brown, who is the Senior Economist and Capability Leader of the Economics and Land Use Modelling Group at Landcare Research, who will present the findings of the survey, followed by a Q&A session. Thank you.
Good morning. It was incredibly gratifying these last 2 days to talk to so many beekeepers that have participated in the survey over the last year and who were enthusiastic about it. I realize, of course, that not everybody in the room has seen the survey, and so I thought I'd begin by talking just a little bit about how the survey works. So the survey was delivered online, and we do this on the internet for a number of reasons. Most importantly, because it's adaptive. If you don't have any nukes, we don't ask you about your nukes. If you don't have any new queens, we don't ask you whether you use breeder stock. It also does the calculations for you, and I'm going to give you an example of that in just a minute. So this is the first page of the survey here. And the first question is about the number of apiaries that you have. And just for the sake of argument, say we have 10 apiaries, and since we're in Rotorua, let's put them in Rotorua. Third question is about whether they're all close to one another. And then we go on to the next page. And the next page of the survey is going to ask about the number of colonies that you had in the autumn. In this case, we had 200. And the number of production colonies you had in the spring, in this case, 180. And for simplification, let's just assume that we don't have any nukes or splits or tops. So we know that we lost 20 colonies over the winter, and the survey will calculate that for you and ask, of those 20 production colonies, what were the causes of those losses? So we had 6 that were lost to queen problems and 12 that were lost to colony death. We had 2 that were lost to wasps. And we even allow for an other category in case somebody had something else that they wanted to add. So these questions are about the 12 that we lost, 12 production colonies that were lost due to colony death. And in this case, it might be the case that all 12 of them had signs of starvation. On this page of the survey, we move on to queen issues. And so we already know that we lost 6 colonies due to queen issues. But of those that survived, we want to know, are they weak but queen right? We want to know about the quality of the queens relative to the previous year in terms of queen problems, and whether you had any breeder stock, questions like that. So that's the general way that the survey worked, and it carried on for another 8 or 10 pages after that. Right. Okay. So I want to get right to the bottom line, and that is, what are the colony losses for New Zealand for winter 2015? Well, it's 10.7%. It's 10.7% with a confidence interval, 95% confidence interval of 8.7% to 12.8%. And what that means is that if we took a random sample of beehives from across the country and we did this 100 times, then 95 of that 100 times, the colony losses would fit in that range of 8.7 to 12.8%. Okay? Now, how does that compare in an international perspective? Pretty good. Okay? Not as good as Norway and Macedonia and Wales for the winter of 2014-2015, but certainly much better than the US and Austria and Belgium. Now, one thing I want to point out is that every one of these countries that I list here are Northern Hemisphere countries, because primarily this research has been undertaken in the Northern Hemisphere, and this is the first time that it's been done in New Zealand. Now, an astute beekeeper is going to look at this number of 10.7% and ask me two questions. And the first of those was, how big a sample do you have? Because if we're talking about sampling 100 hives, that's very different from sampling 100,000 hives. And we have more confidence in the latter. And the second question that an astute beekeeper would ask is, what's the distribution? Did everybody lose 10.7%? Or did some people lose 1% and other people lost 21%? And I want to start with the latter question, but I'll come back to the former question towards the end of the talk. So already we've seen in the previous slide here that there's variation across the country in terms of where losses have been. In Canterbury, losses were relatively low. In the North Island, losses were higher. And we can start to disaggregate by commercial keepers versus enthusiast keepers. And here the definition is drawn at 250 hives. So if you have 251 or more hives, I'm considering you a commercial keeper. And you can see that commercial keepers have, on average, lower losses than enthusiast or non-commercial keepers. The one exception being in Otago, Southland, where the enthusiasts are doing a little bit better. We can unpack this a little bit further, though, and we can look at the distribution in a different way. Averages are great, but what about the outliers? What about the other people? And to introduce this idea to you, I want to put up a histogram. And histograms are not natural for people to look at, so I'm going to spend about a minute explaining how to read a histogram so that the rest of the talk will make a little bit more sense. So the first thing is the title there. So this is the share of hives lost over winter 2015, and we can note at the bottom there that it's in the Waikato and King Country and Taupo. And it's for commercial keepers. It's for people with more than 250 hives. So that's what we've broken out here. And now to the mathy parts. The x-axis here details the share of hives that each beekeeper lost, and they're broken into 10 percentage groups. So it's 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, etc. And the y-axis shows the share of beekeepers that fall into each group. So what we can conclude from this is that about 62% of the beekeepers in these regions with 250 or more hives lost 0 to 10% of their hives during winter 2015. Does that make sense? Okay. On top of that, we have a bell curve. And the bell curve is called a normal distribution curve. And it's on top there because the peak of the bell curve is where the average is. So in this histogram, we can see the distribution, but in the bell curve, we can see the average. So in this case, the peak of the bell curve is about 9%. So in Taupo, King Country, in Waikato, the average commercial beekeeper lost 9% of their production colonies. So this is really useful for comparing to other regions, for example, which is what I'm going to do here. On the left, we have the same figure that we've already seen, and we can see that we have 9% on average. On the right, we've got Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, etc., and an 11% on average. You might think 9% versus 11%. Well, that's not very different, okay? But the distribution is quite different, and one beekeeper lost 42% of his or her hives. So averages tell part of the story, but I'd say that the distribution is also really important. We can also look not only across regions, but we can look across sizes, and that's what we've done here. So you can see there's quite a lot of variation in how much different beekeepers lost, and highest losses being with the smallest beekeepers. The lowest losses were for those with 251 to 500 hives and 501 to 1,000 hives. What about the causes of colony loss? We asked about 6 things in particular, And they included queen problems, colony death, AFB, disasters, theft, and wasps. And across all sizes, you see an awful lot of yellow, an awful lot of orange, and quite a bit of gray. And the same is true when you look across different regions. So the number one cause of colony loss in 2015 is queen problems, followed closely by colony death and wasps. And way down, number 6 is AFB. I'd actually like to start talking about AFB for just a moment because, in my mind, this is a real success story. There are very few hives lost to AFB in 2015, and to me that means that the training programs for detecting AFB are really working, and this is something that New Zealand beekeepers can feel great about. I think this is a tremendous story. What about queen problems? Most beekeepers say that queen problems were much better in 2015 than they were in 2014. That's true for all beekeepers on average from 51 hives all the way up to 3,000 hives. The smallest beekeepers and the largest beekeepers felt that queen problems were a bit worse. I'm not quite sure what's happening with the largest beekeepers, but we can unpack the result for the smallest beekeepers just a little bit by asking about new queens. And we can see that small beekeepers are less likely to replace queens. And moreover, that when they do, the share of queens that come from breeder stock is lower. So queen problems were one of the big issues. Another was wasps. And we can look at the distribution of wasp problems. Now, this question was asked among all the hives that were lost, or colonies that were lost during winter of 2015, what share was lost to wasps? And you can see that wasps are primarily a North Island problem, and especially in the Waikato area. The third big cause of colony death, or colony loss, was in fact colony death. And we had a couple of follow-on questions related to that. One was, how many of your colonies had dead bees in front of the hive or inside the hive, and this would be sign of toxins, and how many had dead workers in cells and no food present in the hive, and this would be a sign of starvation. And the overall picture is that starvation is a bigger problem than toxins, at least among commercial beekeepers. I'd say it's a sizably larger problem than toxins among commercial beekeepers. When we look at this among different size classes, though, you get a slightly different picture. And toxins are more common among the small beekeepers, and that could be simply where small beekeepers are operating, more likely to be in urban settings. One more slide related to that is the percent of brood combs replaced with foundation, and we find that small beekeepers are less likely to replace brood combs. So that might be contributing to a toxin buildup. Now, the survey is really terrific at getting around questions about colony loss and some of the causes. It's also a real opportunity to understand some of the differences in practices and also some emerging issues to keep an eye on. So I want to highlight just a couple of these things for you today, some of which relate to some of the presentations that we saw yesterday. This question asked about whether beekeepers provided protein supplements in 2015. And we can see that commercial beekeepers are more likely to have fed protein supplements. And what about supplemental sugar? Well, most people are providing sugar, and yet commercial keepers are doing so at a higher level. Commercial keepers are more likely to feed sugar supplements. What's the type of sugar that people are feeding? can see that there's a variety between honey and raw sugar, sugar solution in invert sugar. And the patterns aren't very stark there. There's not a lot of differences, but commercial keepers are more likely to use invert sugar than smaller keepers. It's also an opportunity with the survey to keep an eye on emerging issues. And one of those emerging issues, I think, is around Varroa treatment. And I think what's really interesting here, in this slide we have 9 different Varroa treatments, and each color represents a different treatment. There's much greater diversity in treatments on the North Island than there are on the South Island. In fact, in Otago, Southland, there's only 4 different treatments. Compared that to Rotorua, where beekeepers used 8 different treatments for Varroa. Okay, this might be indicative of something that's happening perhaps with resistance to Varroa and what different beekeepers are trying in different places, perhaps. Another issue that seems to be emerging is removal of pollen and nectar sources. And so in this figure we have the share of commercial keepers who lost entire apiary sites due to the removal of pollen and nectar sources. And you can see in the Coromandel and Gisborne area, that's sort of a concentrated issue there. And a related question is the share of commercial keepers who lost entire apiary sites due to overcrowding. And you can see that it's an issue across the North Island. It's an issue everywhere, but it's especially acute in the North Island. So I think from this we can conclude that there's competition for good apiary sites and that competition is probably growing. So that's some discussion about the distribution. And remember, I told you that the astute beekeeper would ask me about the distribution of those losses, but they'd also ask me about the sample size. And so here's the sample size for all these other countries that we've compared ourselves to, and they range from 139 hives or colonies represented in Wales all the way up to nearly 400,000 in the US. And in little old New Zealand, we have 225,000 hives represented in this survey. Okay? That is more than all these blue countries combined. Okay? So kudos to you, the beekeepers, for completing the survey, for providing this data, because I think the data are reliable and they're robust, the more people and the more hives that we have represented in this survey. This is 40%, as was mentioned earlier, of New Zealand's total. So let me just summarize then by saying that the New Zealand Colony Loss and Survival Survey provides a detailed snapshot of beekeeping in New Zealand in winter of 2015, spring of 2015. It's a baseline for studying trends in colony loss over time, and I hope that you will join the new survey that was announced earlier today that will be run by MPI later this year. Finally, on my last slide here, I'd like to acknowledge several people. This research was co-authored with Dr. Linda Newstrom-Lloyd from Trees for Bees, and we have a superb advisory board that includes Barry Foster, John Hartnell, Dr. John McLean, Neil Mossop, Daniel Paul, Mark Ross, and Nick Willis. And we had a final question on the survey that was about the future opportunities for beekeepers in New Zealand. And this is what people said. The larger the word, the more often it was put into the results. And so obviously people see a high demand for Manuka honey. Okay? But there's also some green growth in there, and developing good products and a unified industry. I see all of those things in there, and as a result, I'm quite optimistic about the future of beekeeping in New Zealand. I've got time for questions, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions about the design or the administration of the survey. I will defer questions about interpretation of results to my beekeeping colleagues on the advisory board. And if you have questions about the next colony loss and survival survey, Nick Willis can handle those, or you can stop by the MPI booth in the display area to sign up for that. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, please make your way to the mics. Just to start off, could you please explain the loss of entire apiary sites due to removal of pollen and nectar sources? What does that mean?
Linda, why don't you come up?
Hi, thank you. Some of those questions in that survey are New Zealand specific. They're not from the Kolos International Survey. And they are derived from anecdotal, or what I would prefer to say experiential, reports from beekeepers for over the last 10 years. And one of the questions beekeepers have told us is people ripped out all the willows, etc. And they removed so many floral resources from the area that they lost the apiary site. So unlike other countries that in their surveys, New Zealand has 3 questions at the apiary level, because beekeepers don't lose the colonies, they lose the whole site. And that's what that question is.
Thank you.
Russell Berry, area Taki Honey. I was a little concerned with the survey being very difficult for commercial beekeepers to fill in compared with smaller beekeepers. I think you might get a lot better, more accurate result from the smaller beekeepers. And I'm just wondering how much that is affected by the results. And I would beg you to try and make the survey a bit easier for commercial beekeepers, because we're running beehives over a pretty large part of New Zealand, and it's pretty hard to know how many dead bees out in front of each hive. And these sort of questions were very, very difficult for commercial beekeepers to answer.
Thank you very much for that. I've heard the exact same thing from enthusiast beekeepers, that in fact the survey is very detailed. As Linda just mentioned, the survey is basically based on a survey that has been implemented in the Northern Hemisphere, and in order to really have good comparability, we want to keep the questions and the way that the survey is enumerated largely the same. I think we can do more work, however, in preparing people to answer the survey through things like record keeping, and I'd be very keen to work with some of the commercial keepers and some of the enthusiasts to think about ways to make that easier on them. So thanks for the comment.